Marvel Snap recently announced a buff to Infinity Ultron, going from 5.6 to 5.8. Infinity Ultron has been one of many Spotlight Cash cards that released maybe a little bit weak in the recent few months. There has been an upswelling of anti-Spotlight card purchasers on Marvel Snap social media across Discord and Twitter and other platforms. What I found so fascinating is that so many people were able to look at a card gaining 33% extra power and come to the conclusion that it wasn't gonna matter at all. And, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm way off in thinking that this does matter. But what I'm going to do in this video is present a case for why it matters and talk about the concept that I think the most people overlook in Marvel Snap deck building and gameplay. And that concept is power per space on the board. I think this is a very, very important thing in terms of both card evaluation and actually playing out your game that typically goes overlooked because it's much easier to look at power per energy spent. Much like energy, board space is a resource, and I think this is an important aspect of Marvel Snap that really sort of helps people understand why this stuff matters. Everyone knows that Clog is a deck that attacks board space, and that is part of what makes it a powerful thing to do. But what about cards that are explicitly balanced around the fact that they will cause you a lack of board space? Brood, for example, being a 3/6 with an effective text box that says triple any buffs you would give to this card is the kind of card that in a normal card game, in a different card game, would be a very, very powerful card, but in Marvel Snap is just a pretty balanced and normal thing to be doing. Part of decks that have powerful buff strategies, of course, but really never overpowered in that context, despite the fact that it effectively has an ability that reads as Sebastian Shaw's ability because of the fact that it limits your ability to play on the lane that it's in. Now, why does that matter so much? And this ties in to why I think it's been so hard for Second Dinner to make one-drops. When you only look at power per energy, one-drops end up being among the best options in the game. These are cards that are always at 2-to-1 or more. Even the worst of the playable one-drops are giving you 2 power per 1 energy. The reason that Zoo is not the world's most dominant deck is because even if you are getting 2 power per 1 energy, you are not being able to contest against people who may be spending at a worse rate, say playing an Abomination. But if you fill up a lane with 1/2s, you've got a better rate than the person who played a 5/9 Abomination, but they're still winning that lane because they have used their board space more effectively. In other card games, there is a concept called card advantage. This is to say that drawing cards is good. The more cards you have, the more options you have, the more things you can do. But this is predicated on, in other card games, the game going infinitely long, assuming you don't die to damage. Magic the Gathering, for example, is not a game that has an inherent turn limit. So card advantage in Marvel Snap is much less relevant and much more impactful in terms of the execution of a combo rather than just being a flat good thing for a deck taking a controlling posture to do. A great example of this is Sentinel. When I first started playing Marvel Snap, having played Runeterra, having played Hearthstone, having played Magic the Gathering at a fairly high level, I first looked at Sentinel and said, wow, this card is amazing. It's a 2/3 that says draw a card on it. Drawing a card is so good because of the card advantage, but the more you look at what actually happens when you play Sentinel, the more you realize that using multiple turns and multiple board slots, this is a card that is not actually all that good at doing what it's trying to do. In other words, card advantage matters less in Marvel Snap because there is an inherent time limit on the game. You're not going to get to play all of your cards. That's not a thing that's going to happen. Card advantage is something that increases your options, but does not translate one-to-one from other games. In fact, my belief is that the closest thing Marvel Snap has to card advantage is board space advantage, is the fact that if you play a 3-5, but your opponent plays a 3-6, and they're both looking at each other, they are going to win. And if they are able to consistently do that, and they are able to match you space for space and power for power, they are going to be ahead. This is the baseline predicate for so many decks that we call good stuff decks. What they really are doing is not playing anything that is inefficient in terms of board space or in terms of energy expenditure. And I think that's the way I want people to understand this Infinity Ultron change. At 5-6, Infinity Ultron is not strong enough for you to just play him and be happy with the body. He is demanding that you invest in him, that you make other deck building choices to justify the fact that you put him in your deck. This can mean playing Victoria Hand or Quinjet or any number of things that have been changed about your list to better accommodate what this card is doing. When it goes to 5-8, which is, again, a 33% power boost, I fully expect it to be a card that can more easily stand on its own. And that's not to say it's going to be amazing, but the people that are talking like the problem with the card is that it's not a 4-drop, the problem with the card is that the stuff costs 3, I think most of what they're overlooking is the relative advantage of having a body that is big on the board, close to the Shang-Chi line, but not over it. And I think that that is a very powerful thing to do. We've seen multiple cards fill this role across multiple archetypes. I think a good example would be when Legion was everywhere. This is just a 5-7. It is pretty big. It has some utility. It goes in whatever. That has obviously been power crept out of the game. Infinity Ultron is a card that could take on a similar role. It's unlikely that any deck becomes a generic 5-drop thing. That just doesn't seem like a realistic thing to happen. However, this at 5-8 does make me feel like it's very rarely going to be bad. Why is that? Because if I play it at 5-8, I don't need the stones to be good. I've played a 5-8. That's actually enough for, on a space ratio kind of thing, that's good enough. Like, this is a card that right now does not justify itself on either power per space or on power per energy. Just slammed the microphone. At 5-8, it is much closer to justifying itself on both power per space and on power per energy. I have long had a theory that there are basically two kinds of 5-drops. There are Legions and there are Devil Dinosaurs. The Legions are the cards that are 5-7, 5-8, 5-9, and do something else in addition to that, making them big enough to be reasonable threats in a lane, but small enough that they're not vulnerable to Shang-Chi. And when we talk about board space implications, this is one of those things. The reason these cards not being Shang-Chi-able matters, the reason them being meaningfully big matters, is because the game of Marvel Snap is about invalidating your opponent's investments. Let's say your opponent plays a 4-6. If you put a 5-8 in that lane, you have invalidated by 2 points their investment. People don't think of Marvel Snap as a game that is about this, but it is fundamentally about this. The goal of Marvel Snap is to win 2 lanes. In order to win 2 lanes, you need to have more points than your presumably brained opponent at 2 locations. When you do this, you are invalidating their investment. They have invested in winning a location, you have invested harder or better or smarter, and your location, your power is bigger on that location than their power is. That is what this game is about. At 5-6, Infinity Ultron is not meaningfully contesting even some 3-drops in the game. Cards like Speed might just be bigger. When we talk about generically powerful cards, that is because on the axis of both energy to power and energy to space, they are the best things at invalidating your opponent's investments in a lane, because they are the biggest things at their energy cost, and because they are not downsiding you the way Brood does by taking up a lot of space on the board, leaving you room for further investment. The reason something like Brood has never been as good as it seems like it should be is because it precludes your ability to invest further in a location. That is board space efficiency. That is why so many good stuff decks are built around these standalone elite cards, and so few of them are built around this finicky stuff. You need not only to be able to play the cards that best invalidate your opponent's investment, you need to be able to continue to invalidate your opponent's investment because you have the room on the board to do that. Sage is a great example of a card that gets better the more of an investment she is invalidating. Part of what I really enjoy about playing this card is that people are invested usually in one lane specifically. That's the lane the two of you are contesting. And then sometimes you've both agreed tacitly that the other lanes just belong to the other person. This is a card that is excellent on both energy and on board space. For only 3 energy and 1 board space, she can get up to 12. That's really powerful, just understanding that. The better she gets, the reason she gets better is because your opponent has also invested in that location. It gives her a bit of a clutch boost almost. The more they're investing, the better she gets. So circling back to IU, there are going to be a million different scenarios where an 8 power IU will be much more able to be a threat in a lane because of the fact that they just don't know if you're going to double it or not. The fact that they'll have to play around whether or not you're going to double it. All the things that it can do as a range extender. But at a baseline, what this card will do is do better at contesting an Iron Lad lane, or a Copycat lane, or really whatever. It'll be 33% better at doing that, which means it will actually be able to do that. This conversation has focused a lot on investment, and I think one of the biggest mistakes new players make is looking at things only in the context of energy to power and not into context of, does this allow me to make further investments? How does it make my opponent feel about investing in the lane that I have put this in? Is this the kind of card that is very scary for them to contest? Because a lot of final turns are dictated by trying to understand what lanes your opponent feels are safe for them to invest in because they don't want their investment invalidated. Infinity Ultron at 5'8" is a reasonable body, but what makes it so threatening is that at any point, you could just double that up to 16, and they will feel stupid for having invested anything smaller than that into that lane. The threat of invalidating their investment is very real, and that threat was much less real at 5'6". This is a card that A, at 8, is going to be able to invalidate more investment, and B, at 8 is going to be able to threaten to invalidate more investment. I know that I can't see the future, but a lot of people are acting like the problem is the energy to power ratio. The problem is that this card isn't cheaper. And what I'm really trying to point out is cards in Marvel Snap have 2 numbers on them. 2 numbers. And those numbers work in concert with each other. We tend, as players, to look very hard at things that allow us to cheat energy without looking at just making the card actually stronger when you play it at its current energy cost. I think most people would probably say that a 4/6 version of this card would be stronger than a 5/8. I don't actually know if that's true because the 5/8 has 8 power for the 1 space that you have invested into this guy. And I think that that is an ultimately notable thing that many people tend to overlook, and it's really what I wanted to drive home here. Marvel Snap is a game of investment and the invalidation of your opponent's investment. The less board spaces you take up with bodies that are subpar, the more you have the ability to invest further when it really matters on the final turn of the game. I think that a card like this going to 5/8 could be very, very helpful to it because it means it can stand on its own and make the threat that it will double even if it doesn't actually double. This card being able to stand on its own at 5/8, to me, moves it into contention for being a Legion-like elite 5-drop that shows up in a lot of different places. In fact, one of the only things that I don't like about this card going to 5/8 is now, if I Galacta it, it is Shang-Chi vulnerable. And a lot of the interplay of investment, especially with 5-drops, rotates around Shang-Chi because it is able to very literally invalidate the investment having been made by the 5-drop. Part of what I like about the idea of Ultron is it threatens being a Devil Dinosaur-sized dude without actually being a Devil Dinosaur-sized dude all of the time. That makes it very hard for someone to, say, predict a Shang-Chi kind of thing on it. That's a really difficult thing to do. And so, ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that I think 5/8 Infinity Ultron is going to be pretty good. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed that. It has been a pleasure to do the job that I've been doing. I have almost never done like a fully theory video here, so I really hope that you enjoy the theory video that we have talked about here. Let me know if you like this, if you want more of things like this, if you have any critiques or notes on what it is, because I definitely did not write a script for this. This is just something that's been swirling around in my head, so it's very possible that I did not do this concept justice, but I hope that you get an understanding of sort of the 101 basics of investment, board spaces, why they matter, and why everything isn't just about energy and power, and why cheaper stuff isn't always better for the card. Sometimes you'd rather the card just have a bigger number on it and be more meaningfully able to contest a location. Thanks so much for watching. I've been KMBest. If you liked me yapping, make sure you check out my podcast with Jerry Thompson, where we just finished episode 20. Link in the description. Check it out. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one.